Hey guys, in this tutorial I'm gonna show you how to sew the Karl shirt. It has a lot of positive ease, a regular collar with a button placket, a curved hem, and you can choose between regular cuffs or ties at the sleeves. If you want, you can tie the fronts. As you can see here, this is a double gauze, and here you can see the ties at the sleeves, and I've used a lightweight chiffon for this sample. And this is a classic lightweight viscose. In general, shirts are not the easiest projects, but I'm convinced that if you follow these instructions step by step, that you can make it even as a beginner. You will need lightweight, flowy woven fabric like double gauze, linen, tencel, viscose or similar, also interfacing like H180, and also 9 or 11 buttons with a diameter of 0.8 to 1.2 centimeters, 9 if you sew the shirt with the ties at the sleeve cuffs, and 11 if you sew it with the regular cuffs. And also you will need an iron. You can find the exact consumption in the written instructions as well as in the article photos. I'm sewing this shirt with my regular sewing machine and I'm finishing the edges with my serger. If you don't have a serger, you can also finish the raw edges with a big zigzag stitch. Here is an overview of all the pattern pieces that you will need. You will either need the cuff pieces or the ties, not both. And there is 1 centimeter seam allowance included in the whole pattern, so you can cut straight away. As always, it is important to transfer all the markings to the fabric with a little notch or with tailor's chalk. And also I will mark the center of the yoke pieces as well as the back pieces with a little notch. Next, I'm going to transfer the button and buttonhole position to the right side of the fabric. I'm pushing a pin through the center of the marking and I will draw a little point. If you sew the regular cuffs, then transfer the button and buttonhole position to the pattern pieces as well. Transfer the markings to the right side of the fabric. As the button placket is being reinforced with interfacing, I will fold it and draw a 6 centimeter wide strip to it, which is at least as long as the front edge. Then I will cut it out, so I will get 2 strips. One of the collar pieces, one of the collar stands, and if you have the cuff pieces are being interfaced as well, and therefore I will place them on my interfacing and I will cut them out roughly. Interfacing is being pressed to the wrong side of the fabric so that the wrong side and the sticky side of the interfacing are together. Then I will place a layer of parchment paper to my ironing board to protect it, then the interfacing and on top another layer of parchment paper, and then I will fuse it with the highest heat setting. And I will do the same thing with my front pieces. I will press the interfacing strip to the button placket to the wrong side of my front pieces. And then I will cut out all the pieces neatly and I will trim off the excess interfacing at the button placket. At the back piece, you can find 5 markings. 4 are for the pleats and 1 is the center. I will turn it so it's easier. Now I will fold it with right sides together so that the markings align, and I will place a pin right at the marking. And I will do that at both pleats. And now at the inside or the wrong side of the back piece, I will fold the pleats towards the center so that it looks like this from the inside and like this from the outside. Next, I will secure the pleats with some stitches within the seam allowance. That means like 5 millimeters from the edge. Next, I will grab one of the yoke pieces and I will place it with right sides together to the back piece, and I will just pin it in place. I will pin vertically because I will add the other yoke piece now as well, and it will be easier. Next, I will flip it so that the wrong side is facing up, and I will pin the other yoke with the right side to the wrong side of the back piece. Now the back piece is being sandwiched between both yoke pieces. And now I will stitch with 1 centimeter seam allowance. This is what it will look like now, and now I'm gonna press the seams. Please excuse this shaky video. I haven't noticed that my tripod is touching the ironing board. Now I will fold away the inner yoke so that only one layer of yoke is there and the right side of the fabric is facing up. And next I will grab my front pieces and I will place them with right sides together and I will pin along the shoulders. Important thing here is that you are pinning 2 layers of fabric and not 3. Now stitch across both shoulders with 1 centimeter seam allowance as always. Now place the bodice so that the inner free yoke is facing up and start to roll the whole bodice from hem to the top, right until the yoke, and then lift the yoke and wrap it around the burrito so that the shoulders are facing each other. Now pin across the shoulders again. You are now pinning 3 fabric layers together. Then stitch across the shoulders again, right at your previous seam. This is what it will look like, and now I'm gonna turn the bodice right side out through the neck. This is what it should look like from the inside and this from the outside. Then press the seams. Next we're gonna sew the button placket, and therefore I will fold the front edge 3 centimeters to the wrong side of the front piece. At the top and bottom you can find markings where you can align these edges. Also, I'm pinning vertically so that my pins don't exceed the raw edge, because once this is done, we're going to fold it one more time 3 centimeter inwards and we're going to pin everything in place. I'm doing this at both front pieces, and once it's done, it should look something like this. Now I'm going to stitch with a distance of 2.5 centimeters from the edge with the right fabric side facing up. I'm having some transportation problems here, that's why I'm pulling the fabric. If you're facing similar issues, you can also try to stitch from the inside, with the wrong fabric side facing up. That will look like this. Once you're done, give the plackets a good press. Next, we're going to sew the sleeves, and the first step is to finish the inner raw edges. I'm using my serger and I will pull the little corner so that it becomes a straight line, and I will leave some spare thread, and then I will serge off the spare thread and continue. Now I'm going to place front and back sleeve piece with right sides together. I'm cutting off the thread chain, but you can also pull it into the stitching. I will pin from the sleeve head right 1 centimeter into the slit. Make sure that your sleeve pieces are mirrored, and now we're going to stitch with 1 centimeter seam allowance as usual. So 1 centimeter into the slit, seam allowance, and then stop. Now press the seam allowance open right until the slit, and then fold the slit allowance 2 times 1 centimeter to the inside so that it's flush with the sleeve seam. Now I'm going to pin from the outside, and I will remove my pins from the inside because I will stitch from the outside. Now I'm going to stitch with a seam allowance of 0.8 centimeters. I'm going to leave the needle in the fabric, lift the presser foot, rotate the fabric, and then continue sewing. This way you will get nice corners. This is the final slit result, and now I'm going to give it a good press. Now I'm going to pin the sides of the bodice with right sides together. And I will fold the sleeve lengthwise so that the right sides are together and pin along the sleeve seam. Sew along the side and sleeve seams. And then finish the seams with your overlocker or a big zigzag stitch. This is the final sleeve, and this is what the side seam should look like. And the last step is to press the side seam to the back. Now we're going to sew the sleeve into the armhole. The sleeve will be turned right side out while the bodice is wrong side out. As here is no dividing seam, this is the front sleeve. Now I'm going to pin the sleeve into the armhole so that the right fabric sides are together. I always start at the side seam, and then you can find several markings. At the sleeve head there is a marking that belongs to the shoulder seam, and also the dividing seam at the sleeve and bodice will match up. And at the front sleeve is a marking which will match up with the front armhole marking. And now sew the sleeve into the armhole with 1 centimeter seam allowance. And then finish the seam. And this is what the final result should look like. Now we're going to prepare the collar, and the first thing is to grab both collar stands and pin along the long edge so that right sides are together. Now I grab both collar pieces and I will place them with right sides together as well, and I will pin them together along the outer edge, the long edge, and both short edges. Now we're going to run a basting stitch along the collar stand. Do not backstitch, sew with a distance of only 0.8 centimeters and choose a long straight stitch because we're going to remove this seam later. Now we're going to sew the collar piece, and this is a regular seam, so you can sew with 1 centimeter seam allowance. You can secure the ends and consider to leave the needle in the fabric as you've reached the corner, and then lift your presser foot and rotate the fabric so that you will get nice corners. This is what the collar should look like, and this is the collar stand. And now I'm going to press the seam allowance at the collar stand open. Now I'm going to unpick the seam and remove the basting stitch, as it was just to help get the pressing done nicely. Then I'm going to trim off the seam allowance at the corners of the collar piece, and I will trim back the seam allowance to 2 to 3 millimeters. Turn the collar right side out and form the corners nicely. I'm using chopsticks. As we're going to top stitch it now, I'm going to pin all the way around at the edge, and I will leave the raw edges open. This is what it should look like, and now I'm going to top stitch it with a little distance of 2 to 5 millimeters from the edge. And as here are corners, I'm using the same technique as always. I will leave the needle in the corner, lift the presser foot, and then rotate the fabric and continue sewing to get nice corners. Give it a good press and then fold your collar lengthwise so that the side with interfacing is on the outside and pin it in place. The side with interfacing is the outer collar, and you will see that the lower collar is now shifting a few millimeters. Here you can see it. And now just trim off the excess fabric. And now I'm going to run a basting stitch within the seam allowance along the lower edge to secure and hold everything in place. I'm going to mark the side with the interfacing, which is the outer color, with a pin, and then I will remove the remaining pins. Then grab your color stand with interfacing and pin it with right sides together to the color to the side which has interfacing as well. Match up the center markings and also match up the marking at the color stand with the outer edge of the color. I'd recommend to pin vertically as we're going to add the other layer of color stand as well. Then flip the whole thing and grab the other color stand and place it with right sides together to the color, and pin it to the color and color stand as well so that it lays flush with the other color stand. The color is now sandwiched between both color stands, and here is the little seam allowance at the color stand that we have just pressed, and we are going to unfold it to pin it. And now sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. This is what it should look like now, and now I'm going to trim back the seam allowance to 3 to 4 millimeters. And also I'm going to clip into the seam allowance at the whole curve. Make sure not to catch the seam. And now turn it right side out and give it a good press. Now pin the collar stand, which has no interfacing, to the neck with right sides together. Match up the center back, and at the front at the collar at the button placket, the seam of the collar stand will overlap 1 to 2 millimeters. It's a bit difficult to show, so I'm going to show it later again. I prefer to pin at the center back and then at the front, and then to spread the fabric in between and pin it all in place. Now, once again, how it should look at the front. This is the little seam allowance of the collar stand. I will fold it to the right side in this case, and from the outside you can see that the seam is overlapping the button placket by 1 to 2 millimeters. And now I'm going to sew it with 1 centimeter seam allowance to the neck. This is what it should look like now. And now press the seam allowance of the neckline towards the collar stand. Now I'm going to pin the rest of the collar stand to the neckline. This is the front, and I will hold it right at the seam like this. And then I will wrap it around the button placket so that it covers the seam allowance as well as the button placket. This is what it will look like from the in and outside. And now I will pin the rest of the collar stand to the neckline so that it covers the neckline seam. This part is the reason why we are pre-pressing the collar stand. It's now way easier to do this step. If you are a pro, you can now stitch in the ditch from the outside right here. Or to be on the safe side, you can stitch a little bit inside of the collar stand. I will make it easier today, so I will stitch from the inside with a very little seam allowance of 2 to 3 millimeters. If you are a beginner and you already made it this far, you can be really proud of yourself because sewing a shirt collar is really not simple. And I've been sewing for so many years and still my colors are far from perfect. But I'm still proud of myself and you should be too. At the sleeve hem, you will find 4 pleat markings. Now place the first 2 with right sides together so that the markings match up. And add a pin right at the marking. Fold the pleat at the inside towards the slit. And then repeat this step with the other pleat. Now I'm going to secure the pleats with a basting stitch within the seam allowance. If you're sewing the shirt with the ties at the cuff, just jump into the next chapter. At one side of the cuff piece there are a lot of markings, and at the opposite side there is only one marking, and this is the side where we are going to draw an auxiliary line which is 2 centimeters from the edge. You can use the side markings and just connect them. And now I will press it 1 centimeter to the wrong side, and with the help of the auxiliary line you can just fold it so that the raw edge touches the auxiliary line. Now I will fold the cuff pieces with right side together lengthwise. At one side you will find 2 markings, approximately 3.5 centimeters from the short edge, and I will start to pin right at the marking and along the short edge, and at the opposite side I will just pin the short edge together. I will sew right here using a straight stitch and a seam allowance of 1 centimeter as always. This is what cuff pieces should look like now. Make sure that these are mirrored. And now I will trim back the seam allowance and clip off the corners. and at this side, which is not pressed, I will cut into the seam allowance right until the seam. So I'm just cutting only one layer of fabric, as you can see here, and now I will turn it right side out and I will form it using my chopstick. Now we will pin the cuff to the sleeve hem, and I will pin the side which is not pressed, and here the seam allowance lays flush with the slit, and you will have to check the markings. There are markings at the cuff which will match up with the pleats and also with the sleeve seam, and at the front the seam of the cuff will overlap a few millimeters, like 1 or 2. Here you can see I will fold the seam allowance to the side, and here you can see that it overlaps a bit. Now I will sew the cuff to the sleeve with 1 centimeter seam allowance as always, and here I'm sewing just just 2 layers of fabric. This is what it will look like now. And now the seam allowance will be pressed to the inside of the cuff. Now the pre-pressed side of the cuff will be pinned to the sleeve hem as well, so that it covers the seam, and I'm pinning my pins vertically because I'm going to sew this from the outside. Now I'm gonna sew it to the sleeve, and I will sew all the way around and top stitch it at the same time. I'm using a very little seam allowance of 2 to 3 millimeters, and here are corners, so make sure to leave the needle in the fabric as you reach a corner. Lift your presser foot, rotate your fabric, and continue sewing. Now this is the result from the in and from the outside, and now you can give it a press. For the ties, I will draw an auxiliary line right between those markings, which is 2 centimeters from the edge at one of the 2 long sides. Now the fabric will be folded 1 centimeter to the wrong side so that it touches the auxiliary line, and it will be pressed in place. Now I will fold the ties lengthwise with right sides together, and I will pin from the tip of the tie right until the marking so that the inside, the middle part of the tie remains open. Next, I'm sewing with 1 centimeter seam allowance, starting from the tip, and I'm sewing right until the marking. This is what it should look like. And now I'm gonna trim the seam allowance to 5 millimeters, and I will clip off the corners, and at the side which is not pressed, I will clip into the marking right until the seam. And I'm doing this to both markings, but only to the fabric layer which is not pre-pressed, and then I will turn the ties right side out and form them with my chopstick. Now I will pin the tie to the sleeve with right sides together so that the seam allowance and the slit are laying flush, and this is the side of the tie which is not pre-pressed, and I'm pinning at both slits, and then I will spread the fabric in between and pin everything in place. And this is what it should look like now. And now I'm gonna press the seam allowance into the tie. Now I'm gonna pin the loose side of the tie to the sleeve as well, and I'm pinning it so that it covers the seam, and I'm pinning my pins vertically because we're gonna stitch from the outside. And also I will pin along the ties because we are going to top stitch them. So I will pin these from the outside. Now I'm going to stitch with a little seam allowance of 2 to 3 millimeters, and in this step the tie is being top stitched and stitched to the sleeve in one go. So stitch all the way around, and I'm stitching from the outside because this is the side which is obviously on the outside. So this way we can make sure that it looks good from the outside. This is the final look from the inside and from the outside, and now you can give it a final press. Now we're going to hem it, and the first step is to stitch along the whole hem line with a little seam allowance of 4 to 5 millimeters, and this is just a regular straight stitch. This is what it should look like now, and in the next step I will fold the hem to the inside right at the seam, and I'm pinning the first few centimeters, but then I will just fold it to the inside and stitch as I go. Your hem will look something like this. You can now trim off the excess fabric if you have. And now I will just repeat this step and fold the hem to the inside one more time. I will fold as I go and stitch close to the edge. This is what the final hem should look like. It is probably a bit wavy now, which is totally normal. So just give it a good press with a lot of steam and it will be totally fine. You can now mark the buttonholes to your button placket. The buttonholes are 1.5 centimeter from the front edge and they are parallel to the front edge as well. The buttonhole length is 1 time the diameter of a button plus twice its height. If you are sewing the shirt with cuffs, the buttonholes are being marked to the cuffs parallel to the sleeve hem. Now I will cut the buttonholes open, and I always add a pin at the top of my buttonhole so that I don't cut over the seam. And then I will lay the button plackers on top of each other so that they are overlapping by 3 centimeters, and I will just pin it in place to secure it. And now I will mark the button position right at the center of each buttonhole. I'm doing the same thing to the sleeve cuffs. I will overlap them by 2.5 centimeters approximately so that the slit is closed, and then I will mark it not at the center but at the upper edge of the buttonhole. Now we just have to sew on the buttons and we are done. I'm leaving a thread end of 10 centimeters at the outside of the button placket, and then I will sew the button to the button placket. And then I will bring the thread to the outside, right between the button and the button placket, as you can see here, and I will wrap it around the button twice. I'm sorry you can't see it here. And then I will tie a few knots to secure it. And the last step is to cut off the thread. Thank you for watching this tutorial. I hope you enjoy your new shirt. If you have any questions or feedback, feel free to leave a comment or contact me on social media.